The sunlight streaming through the massive bay windows of Sector 4's primary lecture hall wasn't real. It was a carefully calibrated, synthesized illumination designed to mimic the gentle yellow dwarf stars of the inner rim worlds, soft, warm, and utterly harmless. Professor Higgins, an avian scholar with delicate lavender plumage and a posture that permanently suggested he was apologizing for taking up space, traced a glowing stylus across the transparent smartboard. His voice carried a faint, rhythmic trill as he diagrammed the fluid dynamics of atmospheric entries. "Notice," Higgins murmured, adjusting the delicate lenses resting on his narrow beak, "how the non-Newtonian boundary layer cushions the vessel. In a civilized system, friction is not something to be conquered through force, but managed through grace." At the back row, Riley rested her chin in the palm of her hand. Her dark eyes were fixed on the board, but her mind was miles away, or rather, light years away, buried under the crushing gravity of a planet called Earth. Here at the Interstellar Academic Institute, the gravity was set to standard galactic consensus, roughly 0.8 gs. To the rest of the student body, comprised of delicate herbivores, filter feeders, and fragile post-scarcity species, it was comfortable. To Riley, a teenager born and raised in the high-density gravity well of a Class 9 Deathworld, it made her feel unnaturally light. Hollow. Like a ghost drifting through a glass house. During her first month at the academy, she had accidentally yanked a locker door completely off its brass hinges just by trying to open it quickly. She had shattered 3 data pads simply by gripping them too tightly during a stressful review session. Humanity was a late addition to the coalition, a curiosity sent to prove that a species born from a predatory extinction sphere could integrate into polite galactic society. Riley was their proof of concept. To her left, Toby was vibrating. Toby was an aquatic amphibious mammal from a peaceful world with 0 indigenous carnivores. He looked like a cross between an otter and an oversized tree frog, with wide, midnight black eyes that currently projected absolute terror. "I cannot recall the thermal stress coefficients," Toby hissed, his gills flaring in rapid, panicked pulses as his tiny 3-fingered hands trembled over his pad. "Riley, if I fail this midterm, my clan council will dock my credit stipend. I will be ruined." Riley turned her head slowly, her movements unhurried, almost predatory in comparison to Toby's nervous twitches. "Toby, it's an open book evaluation. The formulas are literally preloaded into Chapter 4 of your index. Index searching causes cognitive latency." Toby squeaked, burying his face in his hands. Riley let out a low sigh and turned her gaze back out the bay window. Beyond the thick glass, the manicured courtyards of the institute stretched out in flawless geometric harmony. No weeds grew in the soil. No paving stones were uneven. The weather was controlled by an orbital array that ensured rain only fell between 3 and 4 in the morning, when everyone was asleep. It was a monument to a post-scarcity, post-violence universe. A universe where war was a historical curiosity, and physical conflict was something read about in dusty digital archives. Then, the sun died. The broad bay windows polarized instantly, snapping from crystal-clear glass to an opaque, pitch-black armor plating with a heavy, mechanical thud. The soft, comforting hum of the environmental control system cut out instantly, plunging the room into total darkness for one heart-stopping second. When the lights returned, they were not the warm synthesized sunlight. They were harsh, strobing amber emergency beacons that washed the room in a sickly, rhythmic pulse. Professor Higgins dropped his stylus. It hit the floorboards with a sharp clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. "Oh," the professor whispered, his lavender feathers puffing up in a useless, instinctual attempt to appear larger. "Oh dear." A cold, artificial voice echoed from the ceiling speakers, stripped of all welcoming modulation. Code red. "Perimeter breach in Sector 4. Hostile entities detected. This is not a drill. Secure all units in place." In an instant, the illusion of safety shattered. Toby made a sound like a deflating tire and slid entirely out of his chair, curling into a tight, shivering ball on the floorboards beneath his desk. Across the room, 20 other students mirrored his reaction. They didn't scream. They didn't run. Their prey instincts, bred into their DNA over millions of peaceful generations, dictated one response: total, paralyzed immobility. Except for Riley. The dull, aching boredom that had weighed on her chest for months vanished instantly. Her pulse didn't spike wildly, it accelerated with heavy, deliberate precision. 80 beats per minute. 90. Oxygen-rich blood surged into dense, heavy muscle tissue built to withstand a planet that tried to kill its inhabitants every single day. Riley sat up straight. She looked at the sealed door at the front of the classroom, then at the professor. "Professor," Riley said, her voice dropping into a calm, flat register that cut through the whimpering in the room like a cold blade. "Lock the primary bulkhead." Higgins stood frozen behind his lectern, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at the heavy doorway. The automated lockdown protocols should engage, he stammered, his beak quivering. "Should isn't a lock," Riley said, pushing her chair back. The metal legs screeched against the floorboards as she stood up. In the 0.8G environment, her movement was effortless, almost unnervingly fluid. "Hit the manual override on your console. Now." Higgins fumbled at his desk, his trembling fingers slapping against the control panel until he found the crimson toggle. A heavy hydraulic hiss echoed from the front of the room as two massive steel deadbolts slammed into the frame, sealing the heavy door shut. "What is happening?" squeaked Liam from the front row. Liam was the son of a high-ranking agricultural tycoon from the Inner Rim, wealthy, pristine, and currently sobbing quietly into his silk sleeve. "Who would attack the Institute?" "We're neutral territory." "Neutral territory just means nobody brought an army to defend it," Riley muttered. Walking down the central aisle toward the emergency supply locker mounted on the side wall. She bypassed the automated medical kit and reached straight for the fire suppression cylinder. It was a heavy, industrial unit made of solid duralum, designed to extinguish electrical blazes. On Earth, it would weigh nearly 40 pounds. Here, it felt like an awkward metal bat. She ripped it off its wall brackets with a sharp tug, testing its weight in her hands. Then came the sound. It filtered through the thick composite walls, a sharp, tearing, percussive noise that vibrated through the floorboards. Thump thump thump. Plasma fire. High-grade, military-spec energy weapons. The acoustics of the hallway carried the rhythm clearly: 3 short bursts, a brief pause, a heavy structural impact, and then another burst. "They're moving room by room," Riley said, her tone devoid of emotion. She was simply reading the data. "Systematic. We just have to wait for campus security," Higgins pleaded, crouching behind his desk. "They are trained for contingencies. Campus security carries stun batons and non-lethal crowd control foam," Riley countered. Not even looking at him as she inspected the locking mechanism on the front door. "Those are military plasma carbines out there. Security is already dead." A collective sob rippled through the class. Toby squeezed his eyes shut under his desk, whispering prayers to his aquatic ancestors. Riley ignored the noise. She stepped up to the sealed door and pressed her palm against the reinforced panel. She could feel the faint, rhythmic vibrations of footsteps approaching down the main corridor. "Professor," Riley asked softly. "Who in this room is worth a tactical assault team?" Higgins gasped. "Riley." "What a grotesque question, give me a threat assessment, right now," Riley snapped. She didn't shout, but the sheer, crushing authority in her voice made the avian professor flinch. The polite, quiet human girl they had known for 6 months was gone. In her place stood something ancient, cold, and entirely unfamiliar to them. "Liam," Higgins stuttered, pointing a feather toward the crying boy in the front row. "His family controls 40% of the grain distribution networks for the outer colonies. A syndicate threatened his father last cycle over trade tariffs." Riley glanced at Liam. The boy looked back at her with wide, terrified eyes, shivering in his pristine uniform. So it's an extraction, Riley concluded, her mind assembling the puzzle pieces in real time. They aren't here for a massacre, they're here for a high-value asset. That means they have a clock running. They're moving fast, clearing rooms until they find him. She looked back at the 21 soft targets cowering around her, then at the single reinforced door. If they reach this door, Riley said, pointing the fire suppression cylinder toward the entrance, they won't bother picking the lock. They'll plant a breaching charge on the seams. The overpressure in an enclosed room like this will shatter your eardrums and knock everyone unconscious. Then they'll step through the smoke and put a bolt into anything that moves. It's a fatal funnel, she added quietly. What do we do? Liam whispered, his voice cracking. Riley reached into her pocket and pulled out a simple black hair tie. She gathered her dark hair and bound it into a tight knot at the base of her skull. You stay here, Riley said. She walked over to the manual lock mechanism. You cannot leave the room. Higgins cried out, rising slightly behind his desk. That is a direct violation of safety protocol. Protocol assumes the door holds, Riley said, placing her hand on the release lever. It won't. Outside, the hallway takes a sharp dogleg turn right before our entrance. There are recessed alcoves for decorative statues every 10 meters. If I stay in here, we're all trapped in a box. If I go out there, I control the angle of approach. Toby peeked his head out from under his desk, his dark eyes wide with shock. Riley, you are a student. You are not a soldier. Riley paused, her hand resting on the heavy metal lever. A ghost of a smile flickered across her lips, cold, dry, and entirely humorless. I grew up in Chicago, she said softly. The reference meant nothing to them. They didn't know about Earth's harsh concrete jungles, or the history of a species that had spent 100,000 years hunting apex predators in the dark. These aliens had evolved from herbivores and filter feeders, they survived crises by hiding. Humans survived by taking the initiative. Higgins, Riley ordered, looking back over her shoulder. The moment I step out, you engage the lock behind me. You do not open it for anyone. No matter what you hear out there. Do you understand me? Riley. They have energy weapons, Higgins whispered, tears welling in his wide eyes. So will I, Riley replied. In about 3 minutes. She yanked the lever down. The heavy bolts retracted with a sharp hydraulic hiss. She slipped through the narrow opening and pulled the heavy door shut behind her. The deadbolts slammed back into place with a definitive clang. She was in the corridor. And the hallway was dark. The long corridor of Sector 4 was bathed in the same amber emergency lights as the classroom, casting long, distorted shadows against the polished steel walls. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled sharply of ozone, burned wiring, and something else, a metallic, copper-like tang that made the lizard brain at the base of Riley's skull instantly alert. Vaporized flesh. Riley took a deep, deliberate breath through her nose, letting the cold air fill her lungs. Her heart rate settled into a slow, rhythmic thud. The 0.8 G environment made her feel light, but her muscles were dense, built for explosive, fast-twitch movement. She moved down the center of the hall without making a sound, her rubber-soled shoes gliding over the floorboards. She pressed her back against the cold wall just before the dogleg turn, holding the heavy fire suppression cylinder close to her chest. It was an awkward weapon, heavy, blunt, and good for exactly one strike before her balance was compromised. She needed an upgrade. Riley glanced up at the ceiling. Running directly above her head was a thick bundle of exposed, decorative conduit cables designed to look like creeping vines, a piece of artistic architecture meant to make the station feel organic. On Earth, reaching a 9-foot ceiling would have required a stretch. Here, a slight flex of her calves launched her into the air. She caught the bundle with her uninjured left hand, planted her feet against the wall, threw her body weight backward, and pulled. With a shower of bright blue sparks and a sharp tearing sound, a 5-foot section of heavy braided copper wire ripped straight out of the ceiling mounts. The ambient emergency lighting in her immediate section flickered twice and died, plunging her corner of the hallway into total shadow. Riley dropped the fire cylinder onto the soft floor carpet without a sound. She now held a 5-foot length of steel-reinforced cable. Flexible, nearly indestructible, and quiet. She heard them before she saw them. Click-clack. Click-clack. Heavy, metallic footsteps, not the soft soles of campus guards, but magnetic combat boots snapping against the floor plating. 3 distinct sets of steps. Voices filtered around the corner, rough and garbled through synthesized helmet translators. Room 4 is clear. Target isn't here. Move to room 5, hurry it up. Keep your head on a swivel, Wyatt. Station authorities are scrambling orbital units. We have a 4-minute window before the heavy SWAT drops. Shut up, Cole. I know the clock. Riley pressed her back flat into the recessed alcove, squeezing her frame behind a marble bust of a long-dead alien philosopher. She controlled her breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Cold. Focused. 3 figures rounded the dogleg turn. They were clad in matte black carapace armor, their faces obscured behind opaque, angular visors. They carried short, brutal plasma carbines held high at shoulder height. They moved with military discipline, but they were confident. They expected locked doors, weeping scholars, and helpless students. They didn't expect the dark to bite back. The lead assassin, Wyatt, stepped into the unlit zone near Riley's alcove. He paused, raising his carbine slightly as his visor adjusted to the sudden loss of light. Lighting grid is fried in Sector 5B, Wyatt grunted into his comms. Just blow the door locks, Cole replied from 2 paces behind him. We're losing time. Wyatt stepped right past Riley's hiding spot. He didn't check behind the statue. He assumed his rear guard had the angle covered. Cole stepped past next. The third assassin, the rear guard, brought up the tail end of the formation. Riley moved. She didn't shout. She didn't hesitate. She exploded from the shadow behind the third mercenary with the kinetic velocity of a springing trap. The rear guard didn't even see the blur in his peripheral vision. Before he could raise his carbine, Riley whipped the heavy steel cable around his armored neck, crossed her wrists, and yanked backward with everything she had. In standard gravity, his 200-pound armored frame might have anchored him to the floor. In 0.8 g, Riley's backward pull ripped his feet clean off the ground. The braided steel bit instantly into the soft gasket seam between his helmet and chest plate. The mercenary didn't scream, he couldn't. His trachea collapsed with a wet, heavy crunch under the sheer crushing leverage of her human grip. Riley dropped to one knee, using her lower body center of gravity to snap his head back with a brutal twist. The sound of his neck breaking echoed through the quiet hall like a dry branch snapping under a boot. She let the body drop. It hit the floor with a heavy, metallic thud. Cole spun around at the noise, his plasma carbine snapping toward the dark. What the? Riley didn't retreat. She closed the distance. Rule number 1 of a close-quarters gunfight, never give them distance. Cole pulled the trigger. A streak of superheated blue plasma seared past Riley's left cheek, so close the radiant heat singed her stray hairs and left the smell of burnt hair in her nose. The bolt slammed into the wall behind her, melting the decorative paneling into bubbling glass. Before he could cycle a second shot, Riley stepped inside his guard. She grabbed the red-hot barrel of his carbine with her bare left hand, forcing the muzzle up toward the ceiling. Pain exploded across her palm, a blistering, searing flash of agony as her skin burned against the hot alloy. She didn't let go. She couldn't. With her right fist, she delivered a brutal upward palm strike straight under the chin of his helmet. The armor plate was designed to deflect shrapnel, but it couldn't absorb kinetic transfer. The dense, explosive force of a human strike, driven up through her legs, hips, and shoulder, drove the helmet lining straight into Cole's jaw. His head snapped back with violent force, shattering his cervical vertebrae instantly. Cole's eyes rolled back behind his visor, and his hands went limp. Riley ripped the plasma carbine from his falling grip before his body even hit the carpet. She didn't check to see if he was breathing. She turned her eyes to Wyatt. Wyatt had finally completed his turn. He leveled his heavy rifle, his eyes darting from his two fallen men on the floor to the human girl standing over them holding Cole's weapon. For a fraction of a second, his brain stalled. A cognitive misfire. The creature standing before him was wearing a pleated academic uniform. She was small. She was a student. 2 seconds ago, she was unarmed. The math simply did not compute. That microsecond of hesitation was all Riley needed. She didn't know the alien interface of the plasma carbine. She didn't know if there was a biometric safety or an unfamiliar trigger guard. She didn't bother trying to figure it out. Instead, she flipped the weapon in her hands, grabbed the hot barrel with both palms, and swung the heavy metallic stock like a baseball bat. Crack. The stock slammed directly into the side of Wyatt's visor with sickening force. The sheer kinetic impact shattered the reinforced polymer faceplate, sending jagged webbed fractures straight into his eyes. Wyatt shrieked, a high, wet sound of pure agony, and stumbled sideways, firing his weapon blindly into the ceiling. Plasma bolts rained down, scorching the floor tiles and setting off the localized ceiling sprinklers. Riley didn't give him space to recover. She stepped forward and delivered a brutal, low-sweeping kick to his knee joint. In a gravity well built for lighter species, alien skeletal structures were hollow and brittle compared to human bone density. Wyatt's knee joint buckled backward with a loud, wet snap. He crashed onto the floor, clawing at his shattered faceplate as blood bubbled out from beneath the visor. His weapon skittered across the wet tile, sliding away into the dark. Riley stood over him, her chest rising and falling in steady, deliberate breaths. Her left palm was a mass of red, blistering burns, throbbing with a sharp, biting heat. She flexed her fingers, testing the tendons. Her hands still worked. She stepped on Wyatt's broken knee. Wyatt shrieked again, his body convulsing as he clawed at her heavy boot. Ack! Stop, stop. Who else is in the building? Riley asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of anger or panic. It was the calmness of a calm sky before a tornado hits. Rot in the void. You freak. Wyatt spat, blue blood leaking past his lips. Riley increased the pressure on his leg. Bone ground against bone. Wyatt screamed, his hands clawing uselessly at her leg. 6. 6 more. Lower concourse, securing the administrative suite. 6, Riley repeated, nodding slowly. She lifted her boot and brought her heel down directly onto Wyatt's throat. The hallway went dead silent again, save for the rhythmic, pulsing hum of the emergency alarm overhead. The air was thick with smoke, ozone, and blue alien blood pooling on the beige carpet. Riley wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, leaving a streak of black soot across her forehead. She knelt beside Wyatt's body, picked up his fallen carbine, and examined the controls. No biometric lock, just a simple, mechanical thumb toggle on the side of the receiver. She flipped the safety off. The weapon hummed to life with a low, angry vibration in her hands. She checked the power cell indicator on the side, full charge. She slung Cole's secondary rifle over her shoulder by its strap, giving herself a backup. 3 down. 6 to go. Riley turned her head and looked back toward the sealed door of classroom 5. Behind that thick steel bulkhead, 20 students and an avian professor were likely huddled under desks, weeping, praying for a rescue team that wasn't coming. They belonged to a civilized universe. They were gentle, fragile, and peaceful. Riley turned back toward the dark corridor leading down to the lower concourse. Her boots left bloody prints on the clean floor tiles as she stepped into the shadow. She wasn't civilized. Not today. The central stairwell of the Institute was a sweeping architectural marvel, a double helix of white marble and brushed steel designed to resemble the DNA structure of the Coalition's founding species. Normally, it was a bright, grand space meant to inspire awe. Right now, it was a massive, open kill zone. Riley paused at the heavy access door leading into the stairwell. She pressed her uninjured palm against the metal panel, feeling for structural vibrations. Nothing. She eased the door open a fraction of an inch. Down below, perhaps 3 floors down, she heard the distinct, rhythmic clack-clack of magnetic boots ascending the marble steps. She checked the earpiece she had ripped from Wyatt's helmet before leaving his body. The comms channel was active, carrying crisp, unencrypted audio. Wyatt, report. You missed your 3-minute check-in. A second voice rasped back from further down the stairs. Comms are probably jammed in the upper quadrant, Miller. We clear the second floor landing, then we breach the administrative vault. Target has to be hiding inside. Riley looked over the waist-high marble banister, peering straight down the open center of the helix stairwell. 2 armored figures were climbing the steps 3 floors below, their plasma carbines sweeping back and forth in tight, overlapping arcs. She calculated the distance. 3 floors down. Roughly 40 feet. On Earth, a 40-foot drop onto solid marble meant shattered femurs, a compressed spine, and immediate death. But this was 0.8 GS. And Riley wasn't just falling. She was aiming. Riley slung her primary carbine tightly against her back, ensuring the shoulder strap was secure. She swung her legs over the polished marble banister, her boots finding a narrow, 2-inch ledge on the outside of the helix structure. She hung there for a brief moment, her fingers gripping the cold marble rail. Her burned left hand screamed in agony, but she shut the noise out. Pain was just data, a signal that the chassis was taking damage. As long as the structural frame held, the data could be processed later. Below her, the 2 mercenaries, Miller and Davis, reached the second-floor landing. They paused to check a dark side corridor. Riley let go. The air rushed past her ears in a hollow, roaring sigh. In 0.8 G, the drop felt unnervingly slow, like sinking through thick water. But mass multiplied by acceleration remained constant. Riley weighed 140 pounds, a dense projectile of bone and muscle falling from above. Davis never looked up. Riley hit him squarely across the neck and shoulders, her knees tucked tight against her chest as her combat boots drove into his armor plates. The impact sounded like a car collision. The kinetic energy transferred instantly through his frame, snapping both his collarbones and collapsing his spine downward. Davis hit the marble floor flat on his face, his armor shattering under the weight. Riley rolled off his collapsing body, using her momentum to absorb the impact and spring into a low crouch. Miller spun around, his plasma carbine coming up fast. What the? Riley didn't stand up. She dived sideways behind a massive marble pedestal supporting a statue of an ancient scholar. 3 bolts of superheated plasma slammed into the marble, spraying white-hot stone splinters and sparks into the air. The intense heat radiated off the stone, singeing Riley's uniform sleeve. Contact. Contact in the central stairwell. Miller screamed into his helmet comms, his voice laced with sudden panic. It's a... Riley didn't let him finish the sentence. She leaned out from the right side of the pedestal, braced her carbine against her hip, and squeezed the thumb trigger. 2 bright blue bolts spat from the barrel. The first missed, scorching the banister behind him. The second hit Miller squarely in his unarmored hip joint where the carapace plates thinned out for leg mobility. The superheated plasma boiled the internal synthetic fluid of his suit instantly. Miller shrieked, his leg giving out as he collapsed heavily onto the marble stairs, his rifle discharging wild bursts into the ceiling. Riley stepped out from cover. She walked up the 3 steps to where he lay writhing, pressed the barrel of her weapon against his visor, and pulled the trigger once. Silence returned to the stairwell. Riley stood over the bodies, her chest heaving as she swallowed a mouthful of metallic-tasting air. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the brutal chemical burn of pure adrenaline flooding her system. She squeezed her fingers into tight fists, forcing the tremors to stop. She knelt beside Miller's body, stripped 2 spare thermal power clips from his chest harness, and shoved them into her pocket. Miller. Davis. Sound off, the squad leader's voice barked frantically through her earpiece. Riley tapped the transmitter button on her ear. They can't, she said softly. Her voice was flat, cold, and entirely devoid of heat. A long, static-heavy silence hung on the channel. Who is this? The leader demanded. The bravado was still there, but the edges were frayed. Is this campus security? You are interfering with a sanctioned corporate asset recovery. Stand down or you will be eliminated. Riley let out a short, humorless laugh. I stepped over campus security 20 minutes ago. They were soft. Then who the hell are you? I'm the reason Wyatt isn't answering his radio, Riley said, looking down at her bloody boots. I'm the reason Miller and Davis are dead on the 2nd floor stairs. You have 4 men left. Take your team, walk out the front entrance, and leave this system. If you stay in this building, you die. You're a single combatant, the leader spat, though his voice wavered slightly. We are converging on your position right now. Good, Riley said. I won't have to walk as far. She cut the signal. She didn't want them hunting through the classrooms where the fragile students were hidden. She wanted them looking for her. And she knew the perfect place to make a stand. The Institute's botanical wing was a sprawling, multi-level atrium designed to simulate the dense, humid jungle environments of the equatorial worlds. It was a chaotic tangle of massive synthetic ferns, towering canopy trees, and thick, creeping vines. The air inside was heavy, wet, and smelled intensely of rich soil and damp vegetation. To the peaceful alien students, it was a beautiful biological exhibit. To Riley, it felt like home. It felt like the stories her grandfather used to tell her about the old world. She slipped through the reinforced glass doors of the atrium, letting them slide shut behind her. The temperature jump was immediate. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mixing with the dark soot and blood streaked across her face. The ambient irrigation system hummed softly overhead, filling the air with a steady drip of condensation falling from broad leaves onto the muddy soil below. Visibility was poor, obscured by heavy hanging moss and dark foliage. It was visually cluttered. It was loud. It was perfect. Riley stepped off the paved walking path and vanished into the dense undergrowth. The damp soil absorbed the sound of Riley's boots completely. She climbed up into the thick aerial root system of a massive synthetic banyan tree, wedging her frame into a dark hollow 10 feet above the ground. She pulled the heavy carbon steel knife she had taken from Miller's gear belt, holding it in a reverse grip. She didn't want to use the plasma carbine here. The bright energy flash would give away her position instantly in the shadowed canopy. 10 minutes passed. The waiting was always the hardest part. As her adrenaline slowly receded, exhaustion crept into her limbs. Her burned hand throbbed in rhythm with her pulse, and her thigh muscles felt tight, bruised from the 40-foot drop. She focused on her breathing, slowing her heart rate to conserve energy. Then, the entrance doors hissed open. 3 figures stepped into the atrium. They moved differently than the previous squads, grouped tightly together, their weapons raised high, sweeping every shadow. They were nervous. The leader, a massive brute in heavy command armor with red stripes across his shoulders, gestured silently to his squad. 2-meter intervals, the leader, Dalton, whispered into his comms. Thermal scanners are blind in here. The ambient heat from the environmental units is masking everything. Use optical sensors. Dalton, this is suicide, one of his men whispered back, his voice trembling. "We've lost 5 men to a ghost. Let's just blow the vault door, grab the kid, and get to the shuttle. We secure our rear first." Dalton hissed. "Whoever is hunting us is funneling us through the corridors. I won't get shot in the back while my drill is running. Brooks, take the left flank. Foster, down the center with me. Move." Riley watched from her high perch as Brooks broke off, cautious steps carrying him down the muddy dirt path directly beneath her banyan tree. He was sweeping his rifle left to right, his eyes fixed at eye level. No one ever looks up. Riley dropped. She didn't crash onto him this time. She landed behind him in the soft mud with a quiet squelch, her knees absorbing the shock. Before Brooks could register the faint rustle of leaves, Riley reached around his neck from behind. Her burned left hand slammed over his helmet visor, yanking his head back to expose his throat seam, while her right hand drove the serrated steel blade straight into the side of his neck. The blade bit deep, severing his vocal cords and arterial line in a single, fluid strike. Brooks thrashed wildly, his hands flying up to grip his throat, but no sound escaped his suit. Riley twisted the blade, dragged his collapsing body deep into a dense cluster of ferns, and lowered him to the ground until he went completely still. She wiped the blue blood from her blade on a broad leaf, her chest heaving as she breathed in the thick, humid air. "Brooks, check in," Dalton's voice crackled over the radio link. Silence. "Brooks. Report." Riley reached down, unclipped the radio from Brooks' harness, and pressed the talk button. "He's fertilizer," she whispered. Dalton's roar of fury echoed through the atrium, suppressive fire. "Burn the canopy." The greenhouse erupted into chaos. Dalton and Foster opened fire blindly into the trees, unleashing continuous streams of superheated plasma. Massive leaves vaporized in blinding blue flashes, filling the air with thick, acrid smoke and the smell of burning synthetic wood. Trunks exploded, raining hot ash and splinters down onto the mud paths. Riley pressed her body flat against the wet soil behind the banyan tree's thick trunk as plasma bolts chewed through the wood above her head. A stray bolt struck the main overhead irrigation pipe. The heavy steel conduit ruptured with a deafening screech, blasting high-pressure water down into the atrium like a torrential waterfall. The heat sensors triggered the automated emergency sprinklers, flooding the entire greenhouse in a heavy downpour. Cold water hissed violently as it struck the superheated scorch marks on the ground, creating a blinding wall of thick white steam that mixed with the smoke. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Dalton shouted, his voice muffled by the sound of rushing water. "I can't see a damn thing." The firing stopped. The only sounds left were the roaring water, the hiss of steam, and the ragged, terrified breathing of Foster over the open channel. "Dalton. I don't like this." Foster whimpered, spinning in circles on the paved path with his carbine raised. "I can't see anything." Riley crouched in the mud, wiping the rainwater from her eyes. A cold, feral smile touched her lips. This was her element. Humans were the apex persistence hunters of Earth. They survived the ice, the rain, the mud, and the dark. She left her plasma rifle slung across her back, kept the heavy knife in her grip, and dropped to her hands and knees. She began to crawl through the mud like a shadow in the steam. Tracking them by sound was easy. Foster's heavy magnetic boots were splashing frantically in the growing puddles on the main path. Riley crawled through the undergrowth until she saw the dull black silhouette of his armored legs through the fog, just 4 feet away. She didn't stand up. She lunged forward from the mud, driving her shoulder full force into the back of his knees. Foster yelled in surprise as his legs folded under him. He crashed backward onto the slick paving stones, his rifle flying from his hands and skittering into a puddle. Before he could push himself up, Riley mounted his chest, her knees pinning his arms down against the stone. She raised the carbon steel knife high above her head. Through the mist, Dalton saw the dark outline. "Get off him," he bellowed, rushing forward while firing his heavy weapon. Riley brought the knife down with everything she had, driving it straight through the center seam of Foster's chest armor. The steel point bit through polymer and flesh, sinking deep into his heart. Foster arched his back with a wet gasp, then fell completely limp. Riley ripped the blade free and threw herself sideways into the mud just as Dalton's heavy repeating plasma cannon tore up the paving stones where she had been sitting. The ground exploded in a shower of boiling mud and shattered rock. Riley scrambled backward on her hands and feet, slipping on the wet clay as Dalton advanced relentlessly through the fog. He was massive, much larger than the others, and his weapon fired continuous, heavy bursts that chewed through concrete planters like paper. "I'm going to rip you apart, you little freak," Dalton roared, sweeping his weapon left and right. Riley ducked behind a thick concrete planter as plasma bolts shaved away the stone inch by inch. The radiant heat was suffocating. She was pinned, outgunned, and her strength was rapidly fading. She looked up through the rising steam. High above Dalton's head hung the massive reinforced glass panels of the atrium ceiling, held in place by heavy durasteel support girders designed to withstand orbital winds. Dalton took another step forward, his repeating cannon melting the top edge of her concrete barrier. Nowhere left to run. "I'll melt this whole room to ash." "Then I guess we're both getting wet," Riley grunted. She didn't lean out to shoot at him. Instead, she raised Cole's carbine, pointed the barrel straight up at the primary structural joint holding the massive ceiling girders directly over Dalton's head, and held the trigger down. The carbine dumped its entire thermal clip in one continuous, blinding stream of superheated energy. The durasteel joint didn't shatter, it superheated instantly, glowing a blinding white before buckling under the weight of the steel beams and thick glass. A horrific, screeching groan echoed through the atrium, followed by the catastrophic crack of structural failure. Dalton paused, his weapon falling silent as he looked up. Oh! A 30-foot section of reinforced glass and heavy steel girders detached from the roof, plummeting downward like a guillotine. Dalton tried to leap backward, but his heavy armor stuck in the deep mud. The ceiling collapsed with a deafening crash that shook the entire botanical wing. A massive wave of water, crushed glass, and twisted steel slammed into the floor, sending a shockwave of debris blasting outward that knocked Riley flat onto her back. Then, silence returned. Riley lay in the mud for a long moment, staring up through the gaping hole in the roof at the real, unfiltered gray sky of the colony world above. Rain poured down onto her face, washing away the blood, soot, and mud. Her ribs burned. Her left palm was raw skin. Her body felt heavier than it ever had on Earth. Slowly, painfully, she forced herself to sit up. Where Dalton had been standing, there was now a mountain of shattered glass and twisted metal girders. A dark pool of blue blood was spreading slowly through the rainwater on the path. Riley pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled violently, but they held. She dropped her empty carbine into the mud, picked up Dalton's heavy repeating cannon, and checked the comms channel on her ear. Dead air. 8 down. 1 left. She wiped the wet hair out of her eyes, turned her back on the ruined greenhouse, and began the long, limping walk toward the administrative suite. The administrative wing was deathly quiet. Garrick, the last surviving mercenary and the squad's technical specialist, knelt before the massive reinforced vault door at the end of the corridor. His armor was stripped down for mobility, his gauntlets slick with cold sweat as he set the last thermal charge along the door frame. "Charges are set," Garrick whispered into his radio, his voice shaking. "Blowing the seam in 30 seconds. Dalton, I need backup up here, the door is coming down." Static hissed in his ear. "Dalton, respond." Nothing. Garrick paused, his fingers hovering over the remote detonator. Cold panic seized his chest. He switched to the open tactical channel. Wyatt? Miller? Anyone sound off? Absolute silence. Not jammed static, just open, empty microphones picking up nothing. Garrick stood up slowly, unholstering his high-velocity slug thrower. 9 elite corporate mercenaries. They had taken the station in under 4 minutes. And now, less than half an hour later, he was the only one breathing. Then he heard it. Drag. Step. Drag. Step. A heavy, uneven sound coming from the far end of the long carpeted corridor. Garrick raised his weapon, his red targeting laser cutting through the dim emergency light. Who's there? A figure stepped around the corner 50 yards down the hall. Garrick's tactical visor struggled to classify the target. It was small. It was wearing a shredded, soot-stained school uniform. Her left leg was stiff, bleeding through a crude cloth wrap, and her dark hair was plastered to her forehead. In her hands, she carried Dalton's heavy repeating cannon, a weapon nearly half her size, dragging the heated barrel along the carpet, leaving a scorched line in the fabric. Stop right there. Garrick screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Riley stopped. She didn't raise the weapon. She just stood there, staring at him with hollow, exhausted eyes. You're the last one, she said quietly. I have the detonator. Garrick lied, holding up a control pad. I'll blow the vault right now. The blast wave will kill everyone inside. You didn't wire the secondary primer, Riley replied, her voice flat. I can see the loose fiber line from here. You rushed it. Garrick swallowed hard, his grip tightening on his pistol. What are you? Who sent you? Riley asked, taking one limping step forward. We're contractors. Garrick yelled. We were hired to extract the grain tycoon's son. That's it. Look, my team is dead. The job is blown. Just let me reach the roof shuttle and I'll leave the system. You win. Riley looked down at her burned left hand. The blisters had popped in the rain, leaving raw, bleeding skin. Her uniform was torn, her body covered in deep bruises and claw marks. You brought heavy weapons into a school, Riley said softly. It was just a contract. Garrick shouted, tears of panic brimming in his eyes. It's a school, Riley repeated, her voice dropping into a register that made Garrick's skin crawl. My friends are in here. I'm giving you a choice. Garrick screamed, his finger twitching on the trigger. I don't negotiate with intruders, Riley said. She raised the heavy cannon. Garrick fired. The sharp crack of his slug thrower shattered the quiet hall. Riley tried to dodge, but her exhausted body was too slow. The high-velocity round grazed her right shoulder, spinning her backward as kinetic energy tore through her shirt and opened a bloody furrow across her flesh. She hit the wall hard, dropping the heavy cannon. Garrick rushed forward, firing 2 more shots. One slammed into the wall near her head, the second tore straight through the muscle of her left thigh. Riley gasped as white-hot agony flared through her leg, forcing her down onto her knees on the thick carpet. Garrick closed the distance, pressing the muzzle of his pistol straight against her chest. You should have let me walk. Riley didn't try to reach for the fallen rifle. She didn't flinch. Instead, she gathered every remaining drop of adrenaline in her body and kicked upward with her uninjured right leg. In 0.8 G, the explosive force of a human kick delivered straight to his chest plate launched Garrick clean off his feet. He flew 10 feet backward through the air, crashing violently into a heavy wooden desk that splintered under his weight. His pistol went flying into the dark. Riley forced herself to her feet, ignoring the blinding pain in her leg. Garrick scrambled up from the broken wood, disoriented, his armor cracked. He pulled a tactical combat knife from his belt, its vibrating edge humming softly, and lunged. Riley stepped inside his strike, grabbed his wrist with her uninjured left hand, and drove her forehead straight into his faceplate. Crack. The impact shattered Garrick's helmet lock. Riley ripped the helmet off his head, revealing the terrified reptilian face beneath, grabbed his exposed throat with her bare hand, and slammed him against the wall. Her dense human fingers, evolved on a heavy Deathworld to grip, tear, and hold, contracted around his airway with unrelenting force. Garrett clawed frantically at her arms, his sharp nails tearing bloody lines down her skin, but Riley felt nothing. She held him there, her grip like a vice, until his clawing grew weak, his eyes rolled back, and his body went completely limp. She let go. Garrett collapsed onto the carpet like a sack of stones. It was over. 1 hour later, the reinforced doors of Classroom 5 slid open with a heavy hydraulic hiss. Commander Braddock of the Orbital Intervention Force stood in the doorway, backed by 20 fully armed, armored shock troops. They had breached the station expecting a hostage massacre. Instead, they had spent the last 30 minutes walking through a graveyard of elite mercenaries. Braddock swept his rifle across the room, expecting a rogue super soldier or an armored cyborg. All he saw were 20 cowering alien students, an avian professor trembling behind his desk, and a single human girl sitting in the back row. She looked broken. Her uniform was shredded, her legs wrapped in crude tourniquets made from tactical webbing, her arms scored with blood, soot, and deep cuts. She was leaning over her desk, holding a digital stylus in her trembling hand, staring intently at a glowing data pad. Braddock slowly lowered his rifle. He walked down the aisle, his magnetic boots thudding softly against the floorboards, until he stood right beside her desk. "Kid," Braddock said softly, his helmet speakers switching off. "Out there, in the halls, was that you?" Riley didn't look up. She kept writing. "They were going to blow the bulkhead," she whispered, her voice dry as dust. Braddock stared at the dark patch of red blood soaking through her bandage. "We need to get you to a medical bay immediately. You're bleeding out." "I clamped the femoral line," Riley said dismissively, tracing another line on her screen. "It missed the bone." Braddock looked at her digital pad, expecting a tactical map or an incident report. Instead, the screen was covered in complex physics equations. "What are you doing?" Braddock asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "Fluid dynamics," Riley murmured, her stylus making a faint scratching sound against the glass. "Professor Higgins said it was an open-book test. And if Toby fails, his father is going to dock his stipend." She finished the final equation, double-checked the stress coefficients, and let out a long, shuddering sigh. She had tapped into the ancient, violent legacy of her species to defend the fragile world around her. She had turned a pristine corridor into a slaughterhouse because that was what humanity knew how to do when backed into a corner. She had shown the galaxy why Earth was classified as a Class 9 Deathworld. But the violence was just a tool, a dusty weapon pulled from her DNA when needed. It wasn't who she was. She was just a student. And she had homework to do.